So my discussion, if you like, conveniently carries on from Dave's, and what I'd like to do as part of this presentation is just to discuss in very brief detail, actually, some of the details and findings from my PhD. So David introduced. Excuse me, I'm just trying to move on with the slides here.
If you just request access again, Ruan, I'll give you
yeah. Okay, I do apologize. Request remote control.
It is actually like teaching games for understanding. We are not giving you the solution. We are asking you to work through the problem.
Bit of trial and error. That never hurt anybody.
Yeah, you've got that now, Ruan.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I do. Great. So I'll just go back again. So before I start to talk about teaching games for understanding in respect to my PhD, leading on from what Dave said, I'd like to talk about first, very briefly, about what lived experience is, because I've got it there in bold letters in the title of this webinar. So I think it's only it's necessary that I just talk about this very, very briefly. So lived experience is basically everyday experiences as they appear, and in my context, as they appear to young people. The important phrase here is as they appear, okay? So nobody occupies the young person's place in the world. So for me, it was important to introduce a range of methods that could give voice to young people rather than doing research on young people. This isn't the time, I think, to talk about some of those methods that I used, but what's important within lived experience is trying to explore young people's feelings, their emotions, their thoughts, and accompanying behaviors based upon how the particular phenomenon, in my case, teaching games for understanding, appeared to them. So what I've got to impress upon you is that we didn't doubt for a second that they were involved in teaching games for understanding within school PE lessons. I mean, they weren't, for example, they didn't see it as a mission to Mars and they were astronauts or something like that. They knew, and they saw what was going on around them and in front of them as TGFU, teaching games for understanding lessons. But what I was very interested in is how they saw that phenomenon. So my methodological approach was based upon phenomenological research methods. So what I wanted to do was explore the meaning of these lived experiences. And the way I did that was I went into a school for a whole year. I went in September and came out the other end in July. So it was a very immersive experience. I think in my opinion, I got to know the students very well. And the way we get to explore their lived experiences is through a retrospective process of recall of those experiences. Excuse me, let's go back one moment. Now, as part of my methodology, one of the most important aspects that I had to take on board and consider was this notion of being in the world. And what that means was that students always come to something or other. In this case, they came to teaching games for understanding. They came to experience teaching games for understanding, but they had preconceived ideas about what games actually were, how games should be taught, the traditions, the rituals, behaviors associated with those games, and hence that impacted upon what they expected when they had these teaching games for understanding experiences within the school environment. My aim, I would argue the aim of a lot of phenomenological research is the following. It's to develop a mutual understanding between the learner and the teacher, the instructor, or the coach or whatever. Because we often, as teacher, coach, instructor, we make a lot of, we take a lot for granted when we enter the young person's world. So we make assumptions about what we think is right for young people, okay? So essentially what I wanted to do was see afresh. I wanted, if you like, to see something afresh for a second time, or based upon my prior experiences, if you like. Of course, I had my own preconceptions as well. And it was all about dismantling those preconceived notions about the relationship between me and the young people. So what I'd like to do now is to go on to this relationship between the game form and the learner that David started talking about in his presentation. Ultimately, it was this relationship that formed the centerpiece of my research. If we make the assumption that a learner is a being in the world, they will come enter the experience with a series of preconceptions about what they are expecting from that environment. So they enter this game experience with a range of preconceptions about what they expected. And these were based on their experiences of games. These experiences of games were mediated by the adult version. So I've got some examples here. The adult version of football that they would experience on TV, NFL, rugby, but they are just some examples of their experiences of the adult form of the game, if you like. And they started being taught, or they entered these teaching games for understanding environments in school with these preconceived ideas about what they would be taught. So that's the first thing. Ultimately, therefore, the learner, and this is relating to a particular experience I had in one of the units of work where flag football was taught. So the learners, of course, therefore, have this idea of American football, the mediated NFL version that they would have seen on television and seen in social media, etc. However, the game form that they are taught is actually this here, this flag football version here, which is might be conditioned or modified or contains representations which are necessary and are aimed at the developmental needs of the learner, as Dave alluded to earlier. So what we therefore have is this great tension between the two. So we have the teacher, if you like, who presents these modified, conditioned, small-sided games, quite rightly based upon the developmental needs of the learner. And that's quite right. That is a fundamental phase, if you like, of the model here, game form. It's phase one in the old curriculum model. However, we have this tension because the learner enters this environment expecting something very, very different based upon their lived experiences of the respective activity which they are being taught. So as a result, and this just goes for one unit, I had American football, other units were basketball, rugby and baseball. And what we did, I started off with American football. And as I progressed through the year, essentially what I did, I was in constant communication with the teacher. So I had the same teacher throughout the year. And what we would do, based upon the experiences of these young people through a continual interview process that would occur week in, week out, we began to tinker around with the model that we were presenting to the students. And I'll go on to a little bit of that in the next slide. Before I come on to some of the results and some of what I'd like to say are some recommendations, what I'm going to present next comes with a health warning, and I'll explain why. When you present findings from phenomenological research, it is vital that you are provided with a full and comprehensive picture of the entirety of the research. And what I'm only doing here, I'm only pulling out little snippets and tidbits to discuss. So what you're missing, of course, is the context into which of which I report some of these findings. So please take these reports with that the necessary pinch of salt, if you like. Okay. So the results of my study over the course of a whole year, and what did I find? Well, as a result of this tension between the lived experiences of the young people and the games they were expecting to be taught, if you like, the adult versions, and the small-sided game forms or modified representative forms that the teacher was providing, okay, for all the right reasons, of course. The teacher quite rightly had the belief that these developmental games or these games were necessary based upon the developmental needs of the young people. That might be quite right. But of course, the lived experiences of the young people in my study said something very different. So if we go back, I gave you an example from American football. What happened? The students, we had a lot of great condition games in place. So for example, one example was, we had a condition where if the ball was handed off to the running back and they made a very short down, they would get 2 or 3 points, for example. However, if a ball was thrown to a wide receiver, then they would get more points. Again, I'd like to just take you back very briefly to Dave's classification of games and the notion of risk and reward. So remember, the reward for the short down is 2. However, do you take the risk and go for what's called the glory pass, as I put there, and go for a greater score? So there's more risk, but there's a greater reward. And that, of course, all depends on the time constraints within the game, what time in the game you are. Is it towards the end of the game? Are you on your final down, etc., etc.? But what we saw continually was that students ignored the short downs and continually threw what was called the glory pass. So excluding other receivers who were in space, they would continually throw what American viewers, American listeners would understand as the Hail Mary, that all or nothing pass into the end zone where all the receivers, all the defenders congregate, and it just seems a free-for-all who might get the ball. But that was one thing I saw. Now, the glory pass is just a metaphor for all other games where we see that. It might be the 3-point field goal in basketball, for example. It might be the attempt to hit the homer every time in baseball. And the list goes on, for example. Other very, very interesting insights we received was that students reported that they were playing what was not a real game or a muckabout. Again, because their idea of what the real game was based upon their lived experience. The lived experience being the full adult game. So again, we've got a disconnect here between the game form, the first stage of teaching games to understanding, and young people's lived experiences as they as they enter the teaching games for understanding process in schools. I've gone ahead of myself again, please excuse me. What we also, as we started tinkering around with the TGFU units, and this was in the ultimate unit actually, we realized how important peripherals were within the context of the game. And I've got here on the right-hand side an image of my Los Angeles Angels shirt. Now, what I found was that students loved this shirt. It was like some totem. It was a magical shirt, they felt, that if they wore it, they became something different, a supreme baseballer, very much like the libero in volleyball, for example. It gave them magical powers. And as a result, because they felt they had magical powers, we said that anyone who wore that shirt, if they could get a home run or batted a runner in, they would get double points. So it was those peripherals, for example. They also talked about the importance of the other. And when I say the other, I mean spectators, I mean umpires, I mean officials, and it could mean drama. It could mean all these other aspects which make the game so special. And the picture, the second picture I've got here is, again, for the American viewers here, they might recognize it as the shot that was heard around the world. It's one of the most famous games in baseball playoff history, where base is loaded and Branca needed, I think, to hit a home run to get a runner in and win the playoff pennant, which he successfully did. And it's one of the most famous games in baseball history. And again, what I did was in my PhD, I used that again as a metaphor for what we should be beginning to think about what we're trying to achieve in TGFU. And that's the drama, the tension, the world building, and the need for peripherals when we build up our teaching games for understanding environments. I'd like to conclude there, ladies and gents. I know I appreciate we're running a little short of time, and sorry to end it there. I've given you a very brief snapshot of my study. And I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and in this presentation.